What we are saying is if you are a customer or a small generator, then you should be able to use the flexibility that you've got in order to help balance supply and demand in the electricity industry. The problem we're all solving is that electricity is an event, not a commodity. It's in its native form. You can't store it. And so something has to flex so that people can have electricity when they want it. And the best thing to flex is the thing that doesn't create a cost, an emissions cost. You can't bring anything from the merchants to the industrials to the domestics into the market unless you're prepared to have revenue agility, to move between the different sources of revenue that those assets could have access to, and move around as the market moves around. So that's what optimization is. Whether you're moving around every half hour or cleverly posting your bids and offers in the balancing mechanism so that you're seen differently every minute, or if you're setting things up on a slightly longer timescale, you're still optimizing.
Hello everybody and welcome back for another episode of Transmission. Today, Quentin is talking to Alastair Martin, Chief Strategy Officer at Flexitricity. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider hitting subscribe and giving us a rating. It really helps us reach a wider audience. And with that, let's jump in.
Alastair, I want to say a massive thank you for coming on the podcast. Doing the research for this, I found that you've been doing DSR for pretty much 20 years. So you're an OG in this game. And before we get stuck into Flexitricity and all the work that you're doing in batteries and optimization and power trading and all of that, I want to ask you a little bit about what the last 20 years has been like. So could we just go back 20 years to when you started doing demand side response? What was the situation then? What was the state of the market? And then we're going to talk through maybe each half decade about what's changed. So 20 years ago, you had this idea before Flexitricity was even a thing. What was the problem that you were solving, and what was the situation?
Well, the situation was that large power stations dominated the market, and the idea of large renewables growth was a little bit of a pipe dream. Coal, gas, nuclear, that was your mix. It was 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And the idea was that
a third coal.
It was about that. Yeah. And I mean, giving nukes a third is perhaps an exaggeration. They were a bit below that. But broadly speaking, that's the market. Is big generators. What I learned in previous work was that if you're using heat to create energy in a large scale generator of some sort, then you're probably going to have to make a choice between flexibility and efficiency. You can't do both. Nukes aren't flexible. Coal and gas could both be flexible, but they had to sacrifice efficiency to do it. So if the customer could be flexible, then the thermal industry could be more efficient. That was the challenge that the Flexitricity initially set out to solve. Obviously, we're in a completely different world now. That is no longer the question that we're asking ourselves, but that was it at the time.
And was the words demand side response, or DSR, where did that come from? Did you guys invent that? Did someone else invent that?
I think there's been a few different names for the same thing: demand response, demand side flexibility. People sort of tend to ascribe definitions to these things that are a bit too precise. Actually, everyone has a different view of what those words mean. What we are saying is, if you are a customer or a small generator, then you should be able to use the flexibility that you've got in order to help balance supply and demand in the electricity industry. The problem we're all solving is that electricity is an event, not a commodity. It's in its native form. You can't store it. And so something has to flex so that people can have electricity when they want it. And the best thing to flex is the thing that doesn't create a cost, an emissions cost, when you're flexing it.
And so you started the company, if I've got this right, the company was originally sort of very R&D focused. How do you make this thing work? Is that right?
We did some R&D. We worked with a couple of organizations. We worked with what was Econex at the time, and IPA, now IP Economics, and worked on the market and what the effect would be. And I was actually quite surprised on, even in that market, what the effect would be in terms of national scale electricity sector emissions from doing this. and it's not a long jump to go from emissions to economics, because if you're burning something, you're paying for it. So that research really sort of laid the foundation for why this is a good thing to do. But at the same time, we were developing the software, developing the systems in order to launch, and the contracts in order to launch, and acquiring the capacity in order to launch. Now, when we went live in 2008, we were still pretty small. The market environment then was still very much as I've characterized it. We were playing against big power stations. Our main game in our first winter was catch a falling nuke. The nuclear generators had a bad winter that year for whatever reason, and we were regularly called upon when they sat down.
Probably worth mentioning. So, but many moons ago, I was working at Kiwi Power, and there was Kiwi and Flexitricity and Lime Jump and Open Energy. There were a few of these companies doing similar things, and it felt like David versus Goliath. You had National Grid to deal with, who were for many rational reasons still stuck in the mindset, although they've changed a great deal now, stuck in a mindset of big thermal things, spinning things, and then trying to kind of force flexibility into a market that didn't really want it there. It was hard going. What about the 2010s? So DSR becomes a thing, and what's Flexitricity doing in the market then?
We were developing the next thing. So we'd already got our heads around short-term operating reserve.
The store.
Yeah, store, which still exists. Some of these services are still running. When you actually look at National Grid's roster of things they pay for, there's a remarkable range of odd things that most people have forgotten about. Still charging a bill to National Grid. I mean, National Grid were okay. To be fair, they were all right. They have raised their game. They've picked it up, but they've encountered new challenges. They've solved them, but they were all right then. They weren't enemies. They were helpful. Actually, I would say when you guys in Kiwi Power came along, that actually helped as well. Because then if we were knocking on somebody's door, they either had already heard the message or were about to hear it again from a different voice, which meant that we were cross-validating each other. And I'm sure in Kiwi you felt the same thing. So from the point of view of the energy managers, it lifted things then. But then what we then realized was that the types of capacity that we were coming into contact with was becoming more diverse. So more in terms of combined heat and power, which previously I hadn't really thought of in flexible terms, and also more in terms of frequency responsive capable industrial load. And so developing that, and then when we brought the frequency response capability in, we had to go 24 hours because frequency response is a 24-hour activity, and we had promised our customers that we would always know what was going on, and they could always call us up.
What does that mean? You had to go 24 hours, as in you had to build a 24-hour desk that ran 365. Yeah.
And it's always the short straw, or is it the long straw for who covers Hogmanay and who covers Christmas Day? They kind of like it because, well, they get paid more. So we've never had any difficulty covering the difficult slots. And yeah, we've been 24/7 since then without a break, even in lockdown.
Can we just talk about words for a second? So demand side response, there was the term aggregator for a while because a lot of contracts with National Grid were 10 mega or above, so you had to pull a lot of different sites together. And then we have optimizer, the idea of being an optimizer, and then who knows what, trader. What do you think about the verbiage or the words that are used to describe these kind of activities? What's your take on it as someone who's seen it all before?
Right. So you could say an aggregator is an optimizer that optimizes capacity, some of which is not big enough to work on its own. And you can say an optimizer is a grown-up aggregator. You can't really separate the two activities. You can't bring anything from the merchants to the industrials to the domestics into the market unless you're prepared to have revenue agility to move between the different sources of revenue that those assets could have access to, and move around as the market moves around. So that's what optimization is. Whether you're moving around every half hour or cleverly posting your bids and offers in the balancing mechanism so that you're seen differently every minute, or if you're setting things up on a slightly longer time scale, you're still optimizing. And you're doing that with quite a lot of variety. Your control room has to be able to cope with all of the optimal optimization decisions that your traders and your data people have come up with. All of those decisions have to match what the customers can and can't do. We've got plenty of capacity that can't do frequency response, for example. We would be fools if we tried to put that into frequency response play. And likewise, if one of the frequency response markets is a bit on the low side in a particular period, which could be just half hour long in the near future, then it's 4 hours long now. It's a short period. You've got to be able to go after the revenue that is on the table for that type of asset. So we all optimize, or you're not in the game.
And so, what about Flexitricity's portfolio right now? What you guys started off doing? You talked about combined heat of power, and I know you had some other behind the meter assets, lots of different types of assets, typical DSR assets. So generators and backup generators, all sorts. What's the portfolio look like right now? And I'm not. It'd be good if you could put some numbers around it, but don't worry if that's too much, because I know that there's a lot of double counting in these things, and there's a lot of braggawatts around the place. Yeah. So I'm not going to accuse you of doing that before you've even done it, but could you give us an idea about what Flexitricity's portfolio looks like right now?
Yeah, so it's split right now between two different categories of merchants, which is obviously the batteries in quite large quantity and peakers in quite large quantity. So these are assets that exist for power purposes. And maybe two different categories of industrial commercial. One of which is, companies doing the day job who have some flexibility in there, who could interrupt production, or who could interrupt chilling or pumping, and the combined heat and power. And the combined heat and power tend to sit, the behavior of CHP tends to be it leans a little bit more in the kind of merchant direction. That's the split just now. We've also got, obviously, as we've said a few times, we got involvement with the domestic side, not directly, but through partners who are specialists in domestic customers and domestic side flexibility. And that I think is going to open up a big new stream of activity alongside those two major groups.
So a range of different asset types, from behind the meter DSR to big gas peakers, range of sizes, but gas peakers and CHP. And then also it's been difficult to ignore Flexitricity in the market with grid scale batteries. That's clearly been an important part of your strategy. How are you thinking about that? And what is the strategy for you guys in grid scale, front of the meter, utility scale batteries?
Well, look, first thing is batteries in the future of the GB grid are extremely important. We have seen massive growth beyond, I think, most people's expectations. But there's absolutely strong fundamentals behind that growth. So we're going to see more of it. And we absolutely intend to be in the forefront of that in terms of developing that capacity, bringing it on, I should say. We are not developers. We don't own the assets. We work for other people who do own the assets. That's always been our position. And we practice a form of revenue agility that is quite automated, quite IT driven. There's a lot going on behind the scenes to make those choices in between the different services at the tendering stage, in making use of the new auction capabilities that National Grid's bringing in, and pricing and placing, optimally. I wouldn't say aggressively. It is aggressive, but it's not necessarily chasing the highest price all the time. That isn't necessarily the commercially aggressive strategy, because with battery developers, these are big investments. A lot of money's gone down. You have to meet their return requirements. That's fundamental, and that actually makes for a very it's a very good asset class to be working with, because you're focused and you're absolutely available to develop the tools you need to optimize that. I have to say, so Andy Lowe, our chief exec, I really enjoyed the look on his face when he saw the Modo deep dive on Flexitricity's battery optimization techniques, which was a great surprise to be seen in that. Absolutely delighted. And it kind of reveals a lot of what we've been getting up to there.
Yeah, we'll put the link in the show notes. We sometimes see things that are very unusual and write about them. And there was a lot going on. It's actually quite a long piece, but we'll put a link in the show notes if you want to have a look. So I want to talk a little bit more about Flexitricity before we move on to things like your wish list, which is a blog post that I enjoyed very much last year, and I want to talk about that, and your view on the market in general. You guys recently got acquired. So the first thing to say is massive congratulations on you're now part of a bigger group. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that and how that works and what that means for you and your customers?
Yeah, we've actually been acquired twice. Quinbrook acquired us from Alpic. So Quinbrook has obviously they're Australia and they're the US, and they're also in GB, but their involvement in GB is pretty strong and quite diverse, and that makes them actually an extremely good owner for Flexitricity because there's no market that's too technical to talk to Quinbrook about. They're there. They're moving in with this sort of inertia provision. They're on the front foot with the solar storage co-location piece, which is a big part of, I think, a lot of people's business plans. And we can't baffle them with anything because they've already thought about it. And if they haven't thought about it for GB, they've encountered it in Texas or they've encountered it in Australia, and they understand the concepts. And I think also the involvement of Quinbrook, it's enabled us to trade in a very positive, front-footed way. You cannot optimize if you can't do that, and that's one of the things that's it's the nature of the market. It is the case that we spend most of our time thinking about that period from the last day to the last second, but nevertheless we have activity prior to that, in the curve. And you can't do that unless you have critical mass. So Quinbrook gives us critical mass. It's extremely important for us.
And there's one other question I need to ask, which is that the Flexitricity is part of Quinbrook, and so is Habitat part of Quinbrook. You guys operate in very similar spheres, right? You both do optimization stuff. You both have a very trading focus. You're kind of wholesale market and merchant experts. That's one of the things you both push. So how does the relationship between Flexitricity and Habitat as part of Quinbrook work?
We are within the Quinbrook overall operation. We are owned by different funds, and that means that there isn't. So we don't have any operational relationship with Habitat. We meet them at the same shows that we would meet you. And I think once or twice there was one, I forget exactly when, but we did a podcast with Quinbrook being interviewed as two separate companies talking about similar aspects of the market. They have their own emphases in Habitat. Flexitricity operates entirely in the GB market, so we specialize in this in the market arrangements here, but we're diverse in our asset types. Habitat would probably describe themselves differently, but I'll let them do that.
Yeah. Perilous to describe someone else's business on their behalf.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So I want to talk about your wish list. You wrote a piece. I want to talk about two bits of it, but for the guys who are listening, you've written a lot in general about the market over the last decade or so, but you wrote a piece about just under a year ago about a wish list, and there was 5 bits in there, and I can't remember all the 5, but there's 2 that I want to talk about, and this is what you wanted for the market to change in a way that was good for decarbonization, lower cost to consumer, all the good stuff. The 2 that I want to pick up on is the end of mandatory frequency response. This is a bit of a controversial topic, so I really want to get your thoughts on that. And also, there's a bit in there about DNOs. So, do you want to just riff for a second on MFR? What's the problem with MFR? Actually, well, firstly, what is it? And then, what's the problem with it?
It's a license condition that is applied or not applied according to the technology type. When you build a power station of any sort, you may or may not be required, as you apply for your generation license, to incorporate the capability to deliver mandatory frequency response. And it's in the connection documents you signed, the bilateral connection agreement, the BELA, if you've got one of those, or whatever applies to the station that you've got. And it says that you must deliver a particular set of modes of frequency response, if required. And the only thing that's not mandated about it is the price. Now, mandatory frequency response, so there's the price that you can post your mandatory frequency response price continuously every half hour. It's going to be a different number, but that's not what makes the difference in terms of the economics of mandatory response. It's designed around thermal power stations. So if you've got a gas station that can generate 700 megawatts, and grid needs 200 megawatts worth of frequency response, they have to turn you down to 500 megawatts. So maybe you've forward sold 700, and you're getting a mandatory instruction to turn down to 500 in order to be able to go up and down to 200. That means the grid has to bid you down, which comes at a cost. And so that creates a kind of a very opaque market where it's very, very difficult to know what exactly it is that you're competing against. On the other hand, the types of frequency response that your typical battery will be providing, you sign up and you offer a price to do the response, and that's it. It's as simple as that. You're doing response, and it's this number, and it's this period of time. Okay, different approaches for different technologies. What's the problem? The problem is that mandatory frequency response was an opaque market that merchant developers couldn't get into. So you build a battery, you would really struggle to get into the mandatory market.
And it's big, right? It's a few hundred megawatts. It's not like a little side hustle. It is a third to a half of the frequency response market, something like that.
Well, it used to be all of it, really. Mm-hmm. The mandatory response existed before firm frequency response, FFR, which is now coming to an end in the dynamic form. So
we're going to have an FFR, a funeral for FFR at Modo. it's finished. We're going to have a wake. We ended
there's a color missing from your charts now.
yeah, it's a big problem. Sad. It's a big problem. I've got a lot of time for FFR. So it was a fantastic service, but
it met a need, but it was fascinating price discovery. You see things going up and down depending on provision. The month ahead contracts a little bit tight in terms of the procurement timescale. You're not really seeing clearly what you actually need. The mandatory market was held on. I think the mandatory market is now less important, and I think we are beginning to see the end of it. And I think really you've got batteries to thank for that, because that's the technology that's come in with the capability and, crucially, the firmness to be able to answer that need. And the firm part of firm frequency response is something that people don't often think about, but it's the most important part of it. When a frequency event occurs, the grid is sliding towards a cliff, and you have to be able to catch it. If you've signed up to catch it, you have to achieve that delivery. And so that is why I have never really been bothered by the fact that the dynamic frequency products that we now are familiar with look very much like battery products. That's because batteries are good at this, and I'm cool with that.
It's a real problem, right? That so that the approach from the approach in designing these services is that you have to be agnostic, technology agnostic, because you want a highly competitive market and you want everyone to be able to play, which actually I get, right? That's exactly what we're talking about with mandatory frequency response. In that it was designed for thermal stations, and we want batteries to be able to play in it. So if we're gonna, you can't have our cake and eat it too. So if we want it to be designed around, being agnostic, that's one thing. But then if batteries come along and they can essentially do all of it anyway, whatever you design, they're going to be able to do it, unless it's like a 10-hour service, which no one's going to procure. It does make things look like they've been designed for batteries, even though they may have been, they will have been designed agnostically. Okay, MFR, we've covered what it is, but what do you want? What do you want to happen in your wish list?
So I think it's fading now, and I think National Grid has seen the exit door for it. And I'm quite content for them to gently ease it out. The fact is, we're going to be losing the gas stations over the next few years, because that's what net zero means. And if we're the ones that we don't lose, are going to have to go CCUS. And the economics of CCUS, in my mind, are going to favor baseload operation rather than constantly shifting the dial. So it is on the way out, and I'm quite content with that.
And the second one I wanted to ask you about in your wish list was there's a bit about DNOs. Do you want to just talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting, some of the DNOs, so DNOs, DSOs, I'm not sure what we're supposed to call them now. Some of them have been great. They're really picking up from that. That was in my Christmas list, I think, if I remember right. And I was looking for the distribution networks to pick this up and start developing demand response options to help with managing the network, and to potentially be a way of deferring network build, or even avoiding network build, and to make best use of renewable energy where it's generated, so that you're not curtailing solar and they are doing. piecemeal. They're not all the same. They have a program going called Open Networks, which is seeking to standardize things, and that, as it goes, is good. But it's not through Open Networks. They're making the achievements that count. It's individually. Certain DNOs are absolutely stepping forward and bringing capacity up there. We're regularly seeing, I think a lot of people are seeing these announcements of new procurement rounds for flexibility. I was actually particularly taken with the business separation concept that UK Power Networks came up with. It's a bit like what FSO is doing with National Grid. And I think that separation of function from owning the wires and operating the system is a good model. It's not the only model. I wouldn't be too doctrinal about it, but it is a good model for giving flexibility a fair shout at being a system management tool.
I want to ask you about a couple of more hot topics while I've got you. So, virtual lead party, VLP. When it first, I can't remember when we first started talking about it being a VLP. I think it was about 2017, 2018, and it actually happened some 2019, I think. And what was the plan for VLP, and has it delivered on that?
We took what's a VLP first? I mean, a lead party is somebody who presents volume into the balancing and settlement code like a supplier. That's a lead party. You've got a whole bunch of meters. You're the lead party for them. That means you're responsible for them. A virtual lead party takes responsibility for the delta, for the small changes, for the occasional ups and downs of consumption and generation that you would deliberately instruct in order to deliver flexibility. The VLP concept, as introduced, is purely for the balancing mechanism. It's a way for National Grid to access capacity fast without having to go through the sort of supplier processes.
So it used to be that in order to take part in the balancing mechanism, you had to get a supply license. And that getting supply license is tricky because it's highly regulated. You need there's credit cover, capital you need, and all of the stuff that is designed for big suppliers. And then for a small, medium-sized company to do that was almost, well, it was very onerous, and it was almost punitive. And so the virtual lead party came out as a way for smaller companies and smaller actors to enter the balancing mechanism. So what happened?
Just can I clarify one point, which is that Flexitricity is also a supplier. So we did go through all of that complexity. And in fact, becoming a supplier is now harder than it was, not easier, because of the supplier attrition that happened last year, which everyone's aware of, I think. I'll just draw one distinction between suppliers and aggregators, optimizers, virtual lead parties, even when they're the same company. There is, if you're a supplier and you're a conventional supplier whose job is to either supply to customers so they can run their business or keep their fridge going or whatever, or buy their solar output as they pay off their investment in a big solar farm or whatever. If you're a supplier in that respect, your board meetings are taken up with the long term, with the hedges, with the collateral, with the exposure to risk in the market, with the various different financial instruments that you need to have in place in order to deal with the physical flows. And that's huge, and it will take up most of your time. If you're an aggregator or a virtual lead party, you spend all your time thinking about the last day to the last second. All your optimization decisions are taken in that time scale. And your focus is on performance. How well did we do? What did we achieve? What money did we leave on the table today or in the last half hour? And so the style of your board meetings is utterly different, and the nature of your teams is utterly different. And if you want to do aggregation and optimization inside a conventional supplier, you're always going to fall into that huge problem of how do you move something that has to be necessarily so large and cumbersome into such a nimble market. It's very, very hard to do. So the reason virtual lead parties needed to be created was because in the main, suppliers can talk it but can't do it. They can think about it and they can imagine it, but they can't organize the types of businesses that do achieve it. Now, there's one major supplier that's had 3 goes at this. And in each of those occasions, what they've done is they've taken a small team of people, quite intellectual people and quite dedicated people, given them this one task, and they've done actually quite a good job. But in each of those occasions, that team has folded back into the mothership, and ultimately the thing fades. A virtual lead party allows you not to do that; allows you to get around that problem.
So just for in layman's term, what we're talking about here is if you are if you have a power desk and you're a supplier, or you have a big fleet of assets, for example, and you're trading a lot of power, then to then create an optimizer on the side for smaller batteries or smaller DSR, you need to be a lot more nimble, and you need to think like a virtual lead party. And what you're saying is there's a utility in your mind that's done that 3 times, and each time the nimble, agile bit of the business has been folded back into the risk averse hedging massive volumes power trading desk.
To be fair, twice.
Can we say who it is? I've got no idea.
No.
Okay,
they know who they are.
Okay.
So of course that happens. Now, as I say, Flexitricity is a supplier, but actually we only supply to particular types of sites. So CHPs and batteries and peakers are the main ones right now. Now, if we, for example, as Flexitricity were to try and get into the supermarket space and sell electricity to supermarkets, what is that? That's kind of a £1 billion a year market. That's what the electricity that they consume. And how large and how complex and how cumbersome would we have to be to collateralize a good price for electricity over 2 years if it's £1 billion a year? And would we still have any bandwidth at all to talk about flexing their fridges, flexing the freezers at the back of the store, working on the HVAC? None whatsoever is the answer. So we only supply specialists where energy is a big part of what they do, and where this optimization approach is actually what they need to make their businesses run well.
It's a tricky conundrum, isn't it? You almost want to be one or the other. It sounds like the no man's land in between is where you can get unstuck and lose a lot of night's sleep.
Well, nobody stays there very long. While we have a supply license, we're an aggregator in the balancing mechanism as a virtual lead party and as a supplier. We're both in the BM, and you'll see us as both in the balancing mechanism. But we also supply balancing services through separate contracts, and we work with DNOs as well. So we really sit at that end of the spectrum there. And we do not attempt to go after. We're not trying to chase for the energy accounts of Tesco or Asda or Sainsbury's. That's not our model.
Okay, last couple of hot potatoes. Capacity market. What do you think of it? Just gonna lob a grenade.
Yeah. So
see what happens.
Well, I sat in the deck dungeon, in it was 55 Whitehall or something like that. These grim old rooms in the various committees that were trying to build the capacity market, and I sat there, going through all the details with everybody else, and with some demand response competitors sitting alongside me, and we were all lining up, trying to get the capacity market into a way that would really work for flexibility and for demand response, and we only just about succeeded. So it was good enough for us to go in the front door. We didn't take the side route, the transitional arrangements. We went straight at it from year one. So we were first in terms of bringing industrial commercial capacity into the CM. And at the time, we kind of said, well, 2 cheers for the capacity market. It isn't perfect, but we can work it, and we have them. I think a lot of the things that we said at the time were wrong with the capacity market have now been changed, and that's pretty much exactly 10 years ago. The famous Christmas Eve consultation was, I think, Christmas Eve 2013. And so many of the things that we had problems with then have now been changed. And I think that's the nature of the industry. It does take about 10 years to win an argument in this game. But if you knew you were right then, you're probably right now, unless what's changed is the nature of generation and low carbon power, because that part has shifted. Is it the right instrument going forward? Yeah, I'm not so sure, because the capacity market is a one-trick pony. And as we all said at the time, we had access to quite high level decision makers at the time. We all, from the demand response side of the business, said you're baking in something that is not going to meet your environmental objectives going forward, and so it is. So is the CM the right product going forward? That is absolutely worth questioning right now. And in the context of REMA, perhaps we'll see something that comes forward and makes more sense for the low carbon future.
I mean, I'm actually totally conflicted on it, because some of the outcomes of the capacity market have been terrific for getting assets built, and it's acted like a subsidy for lots of technologies which are essential for decarbonisation. So the thing that I really care about is that. And so that, I think, is a good thing. And a lot of the original assets that were built just don't run, right? So they're uneconomical to run. So they kind of sit there and take their payment. I'd like to see a lot of those sites repurposed.
Yeah, for us over time, they may well be. I do think, and I know I have brought this back to batteries a few times in this discussion, and I'll do that again because it is significant here. I think the capacity market was quite snooty about batteries. I think so it has this concept of 4 hours. The idea is a system stress event is 4 hours long. It's not true. A system stress event is a zero duration event. It never happens. It's never happened. There are 101 reasons why the capacity market is set up in a way to make sure that an actual system stress event is astonishingly unlikely to actually occur. You may well get blackouts, and we have had a decent blackout in that period, as you know. But you won't get the defined term of system stress event without an awful lot of very unlikely things lining up together. So the capacity market doesn't work because it delivers 4 hours. It works because it tests capacity on a semi-regular basis. That's why it works. And the whole thing about duration was a bit of a red herring.
I've never thought about that before. That essentially what you're paying for is those 3 tests a year. To know that it's there, that you can switch them on if you need them. Which is I've never thought about that before, but you're absolutely right.
If you think about that a little bit further, and you look at the beast from the east, which, as we all know, was a difficult time, and there was actually gas supply issues as well as gas consumption issues during that period. In the beast from the east, it was also very windy. That was a record-breaking day for wind generation, and at that time, Foyers, Cruachan, Peterhead, any thermal generation, even Torness and possibly Hunterston if it was still there, none of that could have done anything beyond what it was doing. And possibly was even squeezed there because the cross-border constraint made that capacity not terribly helpful in meeting the gross demand of GB overall, because if you were to turn up Peterhead, you would have to turn down some wind.
Yeah.
So that is that contributing capacity in relation to the definition of a system stress event? Kind of not really. But in terms of the definition of tests, yeah. And I think that if you look at it in that light, the capacity market could have been a bit kinder to batteries.
All right. So now 2 old blokes talking in the pub, being miserable. Let's move on to what's going to happen in the future. So we've just had AR4, and unfortunately, the global macroeconomic situation has made that very difficult. So we didn't get the offshore wind that we wanted, and we've got some nukes coming into retirement in the next decade. So what's your base thesis in the medium term in the power market?
In the medium term, so what we're going to see is a growth in flexible consumption on the domestic consumer side, along with a reopening of flexibility on the I&C side that is going to enter into the market on the basis of large growth in low carbon power. Now, AR4, yeah, that was a problem. No government's going to repeat that. But just step back a little bit and think about what has been achieved in that period. Multi-gigawatt. The sizes of the blobs on the map are astonishing now compared to what we were expecting. We have an awful lot of renewable generation, and we've got an awful lot that we're building, that we're committed to building now. Therefore, on the consumption side, the flexibility that's required is huge, and it's of longer duration than the first gen 1 hour and the sort of current gen 2 hour batteries that we've seen. So we're going to see a confluence of complementary technologies coming along. EV charging, for example, for the average EV driver is about 10 hours a week, something like that. And that is deferrable demand. You can shift that around quite a bit. And if you say you've got a 2 hour battery that's fixed, well, you've got, potentially you've got the 10 hour battery, and that's in that deferrable consumption that you could move around. And that's, I think, what we're going to see come forward to try to get into that space that opens up as you create longer term or longer duration needs for flexibility. As that happens, there is also opening up a place for more explicit long duration storage technologies to have their first decent chance at establishing a market position. Now, how well will they do? Is anybody genuinely ready with a long duration storage tech that's economically viable? I think now there may be, and we don't hold a position in that. We don't hold IP in that. But the last three to come into the office have been absolutely viable. Two with an industrial link up and lots of earnest thoughts about industrial heat, and one that's independent of that. I think there are technologies now waiting in the wings that can come forward and deliver low carbon and long duration storage options.
So you're bullish on long duration storage?
Well, I'm far more bullish than I was this time last year. I was seeing nothing this time last year that was ready to step up and get involved. The best bet was hydrogen, and we're not going to see that without a proper policy.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see the policy frameworks in the next 5 years or so that make all this stuff happen. And whatever they do, they have to go so fast that it's not going to be perfect. So we're going to have to live with that. It's an impossible challenge, really, to essentially to design policy and pick winning technologies within the same brushstroke is because of the urgency of the situation. It's a catch-22. It's tough.
You also said pick winners, though, didn't you? Which is a famous trigger point for government. And I suppose the point that most of us,
yes,
those of us who sat through the capacity market made at the time, and everybody's made in every other context, is when you design something, you kind of do pick winners. You can't avoid doing it to some extent.
Now for the best two questions. Well, the last one's my favorite. But firstly, your chance to plug. Is there anything that you want to say to our audience, which is mainly people involved in the battery world in Great Britain and the US? So now's your chance to talk to them. And then the last one I want to ask you is your contrarian view. What do you believe, Alastair, that most of the world doesn't? But yeah, the first one's the plug. You go for it.
Well, I mean, to be fair, I've been trying hard to do that a little bit as we've gone on. That whole business of optimizing across the whole revenue spectrum is a core of what we do. We are. You will see a couple of big announcements coming out from us quite soon. I'm not in charge of the timing of those, but both of them are imminent, and they will have an effect on, I think, not just the battery market, but the industrial, commercial, and domestic flexibility market as well. So I suppose I would also plug the concept of going through the front door, if I may put it in that sense. I'm not really in favor of workarounds of little special places for very small trials of this and that. In general, there can be value in doing those things, but people entering this space need to look at the market and say, and look at themselves and say, I'm big enough to be here. I don't have to cower in front of a giant nuclear station. You shouldn't be thinking like that. Anybody with flexibility should treat themselves as a grown-up in the market, and basically insist on their place in it. And I think that by ourselves and a few others doing that over recent years, we've seen a fairly large shift in the way National Grid designs its own systems and processes. And I am really quite hopeful that this new platform that they're introducing into the control room in Wokingham is actually going to make a difference over time. The OBP, Open Balancing Program, I think they call it. Which one that is, I'm not actually sure now. But the OBP is a big change, and presence in that market, which we have. We were the first to bring industrial commercial into the balancing mechanism. We were the first active virtual lead party, and our first assets were a front of the meter battery and a behind the meter battery. We're absolutely there, and we're hungry for it. And it's that continuous expression of intent and determination from the part of the people developing the megawatts that I think has been a big part of moving National Grid's own IT such that they can contemplate this sort of a change. 12th of December.
12th of December,
we're all looking at. Yeah.
Watch this space. Last thing to ask you, what's your contrarian view, Alastair?
To an extent, I've already given it. It's that suppliers and aggregators are different. And in fact, I do find that I'm much less contrary than I used to be. Not because we've all learned, but not because I think my opinions have changed. I think it's just because I find myself lining up with a lot of people saying the same thing. The flexible customer, distribution connected energy storage, the use of flexibility that is beyond the thermal generators to secure networks, to deal with local issues, to deal with constraints, and to deal with shortfalls in energy markets is established now. And I said before, it takes 10 years to win an argument in this business. Well, I've been in it for 20 years. So I've won a few. I'm quite pleased with that. And it's, obviously, it's been other people in the market as well saying the same things that's helped to move it to this stage.
So the contrarian view is actually flexibility is essentially a established thing now, and time to take it seriously and use it to its full advantage. It's not
to deal with all the. It's not a fringe. The issues are in the details. All the problems I think that flexibility providers face are little detailed, little twiddly little things that didn't have to be a problem, and you just have to deal with them one by one. The concepts are absolutely supported by everyone that needs to support them.
So that's all we've got time for, Alastair. I want to say a massive thank you. We're both doing this from dreary parts of the world, dreary Austin and dreary Scotland today, by the looks of things. We've got rain everywhere.
A bit brief, yes.
Thanks for taking the time to speak to us. It's been great. And I would love, we went into quite a lot of detail there on a few things. So if you're listening to this and you want to learn more, please do head to the Energy Academy on Modo and you can learn more about all these things. And once again, thanks for joining us, Alastair, and we will see you soon.
Thanks very much.